Hi, I'm Eric Chudler. I'm a neuroscientist at the University of Washington. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Tim Brown, who is also at the University of Washington. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
I want to be one of the first to congratulate you on your new position. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're heading toward and actually how you got there?
So I was just recently hired as an assistant professor of bioethics and humanities in the bioethics and humanities department at University of Washington in the School of Medicine. And it's been a long road. It's been a long road. Um, so I started off a long time ago in undergrad thinking about philosophy of mind. I'm trained as a philosopher, so every single one of my degrees is a philosophy degree. But I started off in undergrad in community college, actually, thinking about the philosophy of science and the philosophy of physics, and also the philosophy of mind from the perspective of the cognitive sciences. Eventually, I got really interested in thinking about some of the ontological what they call ontological problems of mental health or neural differences, things like the kinds of categories we apply to autism and that sort of thing. I got a reputation for being a giant nerd. So when I made the move from undergrad, from my undergraduate degree at University of California, Santa Cruz, go banana slugs. Uh, my reputation preceded me, and then I started at the University of Washington, where several people were very very interested in the possibility of adding some neuroethics to this up and coming National Science Foundation funded engineering research center, and that gave me a chance to play around with some of the concepts that I was playing around with in undergrad, and um, eventually that caught the attention of the bioethics and humanities department, and they were looking for someone who was pushing the boundaries of bioethics, pushing the boundaries of of philosophy also. And they are the bioethics and humanities department, so they were looking for someone who could push the boundaries of the humanities. So uh, so it seemed like a really good fit. But yeah, it's been a long road.
So you are a philosopher, but you've spent a lot of time around neuroscientists and neural engineers. I know in graduate school you were actually embedded in a neural engineering lab. So how does that work? How does a philosopher fit in with neuroscience? And kind of what did you do as a graduate student working with neuroscientists and neural engineers?
So at first, it wasn't the smoothest transition to have a philosopher in in a neural engineering lab or in any kind of lab. Uh, but we tried it as an experiment. Me and my research group, the neuroethics research group at University of Washington, we uh, we we tried it as an experiment. A bunch of us graduate students, we would spend a little bit of time in laboratories, maybe a lab meeting or two every few months. And each of us was assigned a bunch of laboratories, maybe two or three. And eventually I jived with one of them. One of them was really interested in probing some of the ethical issues that lie at the foundation of their work. And that laboratory was the biorobotics lab and the electrical engineering laboratory. And so they really fought for me to have a place in their laboratory. They gave me a desk and a computer, and I went to experiments with them. I helped run the experiments, uh, and I also did my own uh, interview project, trying to figure out what the experiences of deep brain stimulators are, what the end user experience is like. And so it was a pretty good transition once we figured out some of the details. Um, and you know, I mean, I can't say it's that smooth for everybody, but our collaboration, my collaboration with the biorobotics laboratory, has been something of a paradigm.
And I think what you just said there, it was a collaboration. I would guess that
Yes.
some people might think that when they have a ethicist in their lab, they're kind of watching out and trying to
Mm,
safeguard any nefarious practices, but that's not what it was at all. Rather, you were an active researcher embedded in a lab, right? It wasn't that you were a watchdog or anything like that. You were part of the research process.
right. So in many ways, I was a resource for the laboratory, and in many ways, the laboratory was a resource for me. It wasn't completely transactional. Um, it was deeply collaborative, and so we always focused on what each person in the collaboration would get from it once they exited it, right? Because we all have our disciplinary obligations. We all have, you know, I was a graduate student at the time. We all have dissertations to write and papers to publish and jobs to get on the other end of the graduate programs that we are in. Um, but we also focused on what kinds of institutional knowledge we could produce, right? Like what kinds of papers would come out of the laboratory, what kinds of projects would persist and get handed down to younger graduate students who would replace us when we left the laboratory. And so we thought about the project long term, you know, like how deep of a role will ethics play in each other's work, and how deep of a role will the engineering play in each other's work. So my dissertation ended up being a good chunk of, you know, engineering work, and their dissertations, the other graduate students in the laboratory, two of them ended up writing entire chapters or 2 or 3 chapters of their dissertation on ethics. One on, you know, neurosecurity, and another on, you know, different philosophical issues uh, surrounding brain-computer interfaces, and another chapter on, what was it? Just like collaborations with ethicists. So we ended up writing a kind of playbook for how to do this sort of thing. So yeah, it was deeply collaborative and deeply productive.
Mhm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if other labs across the country, across the world, sort of take up that model of having an embedded ethicist in their lab. So it
Mhm.
might be a model that others will use in their own work. Now, when you start your new job, do you have a research agenda proposed, or what kind of questions do you anticipate asking in your new job?
Yeah, so most of my graduate and postdoctoral work has been on neurotechnologies and people's experiences of them. And I want to keep working on those kinds of projects. So the project that I'm working on now is considering how uh, things like prosthetic limbs are are partners in the everyday business of agency, of being a person in the world who makes decisions and has to, you know, intend and uh, you know, live with the consequences of their intentions or their enacted intentions, with a prosthetic limb. The prospect of using sensory systems to stimulate the brain in ways that give you sensory feedback, um, changes that relationship. I think there's a relationship that we form with technologies like prosthetic limbs and assistive robotics, uh, and being able to feel what the prosthetic limbs sense changes that relationship. And so my current projects are on uh, how we feel more or less of a sense of embodiment with our prosthetic limbs or our assistive robotics when we have that kind of feedback. Uh, but in the future, I want to think more about the artificial intelligence that drives those systems. I want to think about whether or not we can trust those artificial intelligent systems, and whether or not they're using, categories for analysis that hurt people. And I'm thinking about this from a social justice perspective. And this is kind of a new or nascent area of my field, neuroethics, thinking about the social justice implications of these technologies and their uses and the funding models behind them and the whole regulatory apparatus that supports them. So that's going to be the top thing on my agenda, trying to figure out, well, if there are artificial intelligence artificially intelligent systems that make these robotics work or make neurostimulators work, how are we going to make sure that they don't harm vulnerable communities? How are we going to make sure they're accessible? How are we going to make sure that researchers from every kind of community, including, people of color, people with disabilities, queer folks, so on and so forth, have some say in how these devices are developed? And I'm going to go for grants to see about, making some headway there. I'm already part of a lot of international committees, putting together programming for that purpose. Hopefully I'll be successful.
As a new professor, will you have any teaching responsibilities?
I will. Two
Will you be
courses a
good?
year.
How many?
Two.
2 courses a year.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brown, for joining me today. I wish you all the luck, all the best of luck in your new position, and I'm
Thank
sure I'll
you.
be seeing you around campus.
Absolutely. You can count on it.
Okay. See you later, Tim. Bye.